time stops for no one. For some, it goes too fast. For others, it's too slow. And sometimes when you lose track of time, you can never get it back.
Kipton, the train going to Toledo, was supposed to pull off the track, but their clocks weren't synchronized properly, and the fast mail train had a head-on collision with the train headed toward Toledo.
A nice little town, had a train station.
It had 2 grocery stores, a hardware store. There were either 4 or 5 gas stations. The passenger train went through in the morning and in the evening from Cleveland to Toledo, and it was called the Plug. The mail was delivered on a post sticking out over the rail that they delivered, I guess, once a day and picked up then.
Westbound train, number 21, which is also called the Toledo Express, he had orders to stop at Kipton, the eastbound fast mail by. And typically the eastbound fast mail never slowed for Kipton at all. It just went barreling on through.
The fast mail was going at full speed, and the collision was so intense that 6 postal clerks and 2 engineers died on impact.
Killed both the engineers, so nobody really knows what was going on in their heads. And unfortunately collapsed first couple of cars on themselves, and the mail clerks inside, they really didn't have a chance. They probably didn't even know it was coming.
According to a report the night of the crash, the engine of the Toledo Express was knocked squarely across the track, and that of the fast mail reared in the air, resting on top of the other. The first and second mail cars were telescoped and smashed to kindling wood, and the third crashed into the first 2 and rolled over on the station platform. Passengers were thrown to the floor and badly shaken, but all survived.
Between 1890 and 1900, there were 80 mail clerks that were killed because of train wrecks, and over 2,000 that were injured in train wrecks. One of the problems was that the letter cars were made out of wood, which just dissolved. The Postmaster General was soliciting Congress to have the railroads make their cars out of metal. And the other thing was that the problem they identified was that the watches of the 2 engineers were not synchronized. The watch of the one engineer had been off by 4 minutes.
He dropped his pocket watch in a mud puddle. And of course then he had to bend down, fish out his pocket watch, and when he did, it wasn't running. And he had to swish it around in the water a little bit and get the mud off of it, and then it started running. So he went and he had his orders already, and he had his clearance to leave, so he went and got on his locomotive and they left. What he didn't know was his watch had stopped for 4 minutes.
Since both of the engineers died in the crash, no one knows exactly what may have caused the watch to stop, but most of the details of the crash that have been passed down in history seem to stem from an article written by reporter James Morrow in 1910, which was a result of a personal interview with Webb C. Ball. Either way, there's no denying the deadly crash occurred, and as a result, crash investigators realized the importance of developing a better way to improve railroad watch accuracy.
Members of Congress came to Cleveland, and they were staying downtown Cleveland, and they happened to walk by Webb C. Ball's little small repair shop. And there in the front window was a chronometer showing accurate time. And, the congressional members were quite impressed by this.
When Standard Time was adopted in 1883, Ball was the first jeweler to use time signals to bring accurate time to Cleveland on July 19, 1891. So after the wreck in Kipton was viewed and the railway officials with the Lakeshore Line realized the cause of the accident, the general superintendent of the line enlisted Webb C. Ball to institute accurate timekeeping on the railroads as their chief time inspector.
This was a huge city. It had everything. It had steel, it had oil, it had everything going on. The Rockefeller fortune was here. It was a very, very vibrant city. Being that vibrancy, of course, brought all the railroads here, and you had a great draw for putting together this history with the railroads and the watches because of everything that was going on here. Everything came in and out of Cleveland one way or another.
It was that entrepreneurial spirit happening in Cleveland, Ohio at the turn of the century that Webb C. Ball became a part of. He was already a well-known jeweler and watchmaker, but he was in the right place at the right time for a massive business opportunity. Thanks to his keen entrepreneurial thinking, he was able to seize the moment. Ball's role as chief time inspector not only enhanced his business and image even more, but it drastically impacted the railroad industry. The initial movement to standardize time for the railroads began a bit earlier in the 1870s to improve uniformity in time across the country and reduce the number of accidents and near misses that were becoming more frequent as train travel increased.
Watches and clocks were fairly expensive up until they were mass produced, so most people depended on a town clock or a church clock to figure out what time it was. And each of those towns would have had their own time because typically they weren't real accurate, the clocks, so you reset them usually or adjusted them daily or every couple of days at noon when you had the sun out and you could check your sundial. So, the people in Cleveland would have had a different time than the people in Euclid or somewhere just a few miles away. But with the Industrial Revolution and the coming of the trains, where you had trains going along 20, 30, 40 mile an hour and coming from opposite directions, and I have the time from my hometown an hour west of here and you had yours from east, it made for some spectacular wrecks along the railroads. And so the railroads really took the lead in standardizing time and eventually dividing the country into time zones.
Webb C. Ball was instrumental in keeping trains running on time by developing high-quality, precise timekeeping.
He developed the standard watch to use on the railroad. It had to be accurate to within 30 seconds a week. It had to not vary more than a couple seconds a day in any position. And when he did this, he was able to at least make the railroad safer for individuals and the workers so that maybe there would be fewer accidents.
According to the National Railway Historical Society, there was no systematic recording of railroad accidents until early in the 20th century, when the Interstate Commerce Commission made meticulous records of the causes of rail accidents. So there is no way to determine how many accidents were prevented by the work done by Ball and his employees. But many collectors and historians believe it may have been hundreds, if not thousands, of lives saved over the years.
As more and more accurate timepieces made their way onto the railroads, gosh, the collisions just went way down. A lot less loss of property and life. And the people who appreciated it most were the guys running the steam locomotives, because they were the first guys to get killed in a collision. They wanted to have one guy in charge of it nationwide. So I think, he got the nickel plate first because they were in Cleveland. He would get the Pennsylvania, the B&O, the C&O. They all just really fell into line. Really at the apex of his career, he controlled timekeeping on 125,000 miles of railway throughout our nation, Mexico, and Canada. And that's not just the railroad watches that the men wore, but also the clocks and the depots and the station houses.
Depot and station house clocks were used by the railroad workers to check the time on their watches before heading out on a trip, tracking when the watch was regulated in a logbook. And the time on the clocks, designated as standard clocks because they were high quality and maintained strict standards, was set by a time signal transmitted by telegraph once every 24 hours through the U.S. Naval Observatory.
If you were an engineer or a conductor, you were basically ordered to go purchase one of these watches And about every week or so, you had to have the watch checked by the time department and make sure your watch was running properly.
According to the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, the actual inspectors were the same jewelers who were the Ball Watch Company dealers.
And we're talking railroad men when they bought like a 21 jewel Hamilton Ball watch. You know, we're talking about 3-4 months salary for them. They had to buy them over time. It was a tremendous expenditure for these guys.
So who was Webster Clay Ball? He was born on October 6, 1847, on a farm near the small town of Fredericktown, Ohio.
He was a true entrepreneur, started off as a watchmaker. He actually worked for the Duber Hampton, and Webb C. Ball worked for him for about 5 years, selling watch cases to all the jewelers across the country. And I think that's what got Webb C. Ball the connections that later really helped him in establishing watch inspectors throughout the nation. Born in Knox County, he apprenticed down in Mount Gilead, Ohio. He couldn't hold a job. It was kind of surprising. He worked for a jeweler for a few months, and then he'd leave, but he really just didn't quite seem to hold a job for a long period of time until he bought out, there was a jewelry store that he worked at as a watchmaker called Whitcomb and Metten. And they were downtown Cleveland. Webb C. Ball went to work there, bought out Mr. Metten, and the jewelry store name changed to Whitcomb and Ball. It's interesting how he got started from such humble beginnings in Knox County, working for other jewelers, into opening what was referred to as the Tiffany's of the Midwest.
The Webb C. Ball Company began in 1881 at Superior Avenue and Seneca, now West 3rd, in downtown Cleveland, consisting of 2 showcases and a workbench. It was incorporated in 1891 and moved into its own building at 1114 Euclid Avenue in 1911.
Largest jewelry store between Chicago and New York. Fantastic, unbelievable.
Outside the building, a large bronze Webb C. Ball clock became an iconic sidewalk fixture. The railroad watch business enhanced his company so much that inside the building it was separated into 4 divisions: the Ball Retail Jewelry Store, the Ball Watch Company, the Ball Railroad Standard Watch Company, and the national headquarters of the Railroad Time and Watch Inspection Service, which was established by Ball. The last division performed time inspection services under contract to the railroads. As you can see by these Ball catalog photos, the showcases inside the store sparkled with fine jewelry and other high-end gifts, including vases, mirrors, and polished silver.
When they closed the jewelry store, they had 13 volumes called the Diamond Registers, and these listed all of the names of Cleveland notables who purchased diamonds from Webb C. Ball. And, you know, these went up to $50,000, $60,000 for a diamond.
Although Ball was a jeweler and became even more well-known for his watches, he never actually made the watches himself. He used his remarkable business skills to acquire nothing but the best and make them even better.
When Ball got watches, and he got them from various companies. He got them from Hamilton, he got them from Waltham, he got them from Elgin. His kind of persuasion to get these companies to sell more watches or clocks, you know, that if you put my name on them, we're going to sell them more. People associate me with quality and accuracy, therefore maybe I can sell your clocks, and I think it must have worked.
Believe this or not, but a lot of the watch companies didn't like Ball at first because he kind of played the 800-pound gorilla with them. He went to them and said, listen, guys, this is how they're going to be made. And a lot of these watch companies said, you know, we can make them a whole lot cheaper and we don't need to do it this way.
But Ball stood behind his high standards, and the railroad company stood behind Ball. He ordered watches to a certain specification and then made sure they worked right, so he could proudly put his name on them.
One of the advertisements was, buy a Ball and time them all.
Another more familiar saying reportedly stemming from Ball is, get on the ball.
And when he got these watches, the watches were again dismantled and reconstructed so that they ran in such a way that they kept time to within a very few seconds a week. And that's what made the watches exceptional.
According to Ball watch collector Joel Sarich, that quality came from the critical adjustments Ball made to these watches.
Adjustments to things like the balance wheel and the hairspring to make sure that the watches all did what they were supposed to do. He had several people working for him and several watchmakers. He had one lady that worked for him for quite a while. Her name was Mary Babcock. And Mary was the lady that wound all the watches up when they were tested and put them either in refrigeration units to test them in the cold or in ovens to test them in heat.
After testing them, if any of the watches didn't run right, she'd send them right back to the watchmakers.
And I read it in one account that one of her observations was when the watch wasn't timing properly, it was always an adjustment with the hairspring that had to happen. The hairspring is the fine spring on the balance wheel that governs the amplitude of the swing of the balance and hence is the heart of the timekeeping mechanism of the watch.
Ball also required that all of his watches have at least 17 jewels for railroad accuracy.
The jewels, of course, are the bearings of the pivots of the wheels, and a 17-jewel watch would be jeweled throughout the watch all the way up to the center wheel.
Collectors say you can't miss a Ball watch, based solely on its unique look.
The decoration on a watch is called damascening, and he decorated them in a certain way, and you can always tell a Ball watch. Even if you don't know the name, you can tell it by the decorations on the movement.
Well, they're always signed, but there's always extra quality to them.
These were lever set. Right here at the edge of the dial by the 2, there's a little lever. That was so that when the watch was set to time, you couldn't alter the time on that watch.
The little screws on the sides here.
Don Barrett is an expert on Ball watches. He's been collecting them for decades and has amassed quite a collection over the years.
Well, how many I have? It's literally a mind-boggling number. The good ones are certainly kept, off premises at the bank.
He says it all started years ago in Virginia.
I'd always liked antiques, so kind of quite by accident, I was in an antique shop and happened to buy a Hamilton 992 railroad pocket watch for $25. And a few days later, a fellow came over and bought it from me for $100.
Since then, collecting watches and clocks has become Don's passion. Just ask his wife, Karen. It goes back to when they were just dating.
I found our dates weren't typical dates going out to dinner or movies, but they're going to watch and clock shows. So I should have known very early on that I had a gentleman with a obsessive compulsive disorder for pocket watches.
Years later, his hobby is the driving force behind the business he and Karen own in downtown Kent, Ohio. City Bank Antiques.
There for a while, when Karen and I would go to the watch shows, we would walk in the room and people would just absolutely swarm our table. It was unbelievable.
But in recent years, all of that has changed.
With the advent of eBay, all of the people who had grandfather's pocket watch in their drawer and didn't know what it was worth, and maybe they would have sold it to the local jeweler for $100, and the local jeweler sold it to a picker for $300, and the picker took it to a watch show and sold it for $1,000. That's all been eliminated now.
These watches are just a peek at some of Don's large personal collection.
Well, this is a pocket watch, of course, with the railroad logo on the dial. That's a full-color steam locomotive. In the seconds bit, you have the letters BLE, which stands for Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers.
Don also has a number of rare clocks in his collection that hung in train depots, and one extra special watch with quite a story behind it.
So the very first Webb Ball watch made by Hamilton is in my pocket. And it was Webb Ball's personal watch.
He says he got a call from an antique dealer in Cleveland saying he had a Ball watch with serial number 601.
I'm thinking to myself, there's no way, I've never heard of one this low.
The story comes straight from the grandson of the original owner.
His grandfather worked on the railroad. His legs were caught between two railroad cars. Cut his legs off.
He says his grandfather was in the Union, and they gave him the job of running the elevator in the BLE building.
He sat on a stool and ran the elevator up and down. Well, Webb C. Ball was getting in with the railroads, so he was making really quite often visits to the BLE building in Cleveland. And over the years, he became very good friends with the fellow who ran the elevator, such that at the end of the day, when the fellow who ran the elevator was scheduled to retire, pulled the watch out of his vest and gave it to him as a retirement gift. It was Webb C. Ball's personal watch, the very first Ball watch made.
I found one that I liked.
Don is certainly not alone in his passion for watch and clock collecting. Steve Humphrey is the executive director of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors.
The organization started in 1943, so we're coming up close to our 75th anniversary. We have 15,000 members in 50 countries around the world. We have about 150 chapters. We have one of our stronger chapters here in the Cleveland area.
David Lima, the chair of the regional meeting held at Lakeland Community College in Kirtland, Ohio, says this is their largest meeting each year, and people travel quite a distance to be here. This is the group's fourth year inviting the public to the event.
Partly our reason for wanting the public involved, besides to educate them about this particular area of collecting, has to do with socializing. We're an older group, I would say, for the most part, but in the digital age, mechanical watches and mechanical clocks aren't the thing that younger people tend to be interested in.
26-year-old Christopher J. Giegerick is helping to increase membership. He joined 3 years ago and is one of the group's youngest collectors.
I got interested in watches and the mechanics of them, and actually ended up at Don Barrett's shop down in Kent, and he's got a lot of Webb C. Ball stuff as well. Started researching it a little bit, and it just kind of spiraled out of control from there.
He says he has about 10 Ball watches and a few Webb C. Ball schoolhouse clocks.
I was already collecting railroad watches, and you would go to, that's the high-end stuff, is the Webb C. Ball watches.
He's hoping other young people will follow in his footsteps.
A lot of people my age don't know the history of Cleveland and all the great people that were here at one time.
I think it's just part of our heritage, and especially from the manufacturing standpoint. A lot of what goes on today in manufacturing was developed because of clock and watch manufacturing, especially mass production.
30-year member Thomas Borkowski is displaying one of his Ball clocks in the North Coast Regional Exhibit tied to some important Cleveland history.
This clock was the master timekeeper at the Collinwood Railroad Yards on 152nd Street in Cleveland. The clock was taken out in 1960 when the roundhouse was torn down.
Nearly a decade ago, James Wagner, president of the Fredericktown Area Historical Society, was also interested in relocating an iconic clock and preserving a piece of history. He wanted to move the one that stood in front of the Webb C. Ball building in downtown Cleveland to Fredericktown, where Ball was born. He was told the clock may be scrapped during the widening process on Euclid Avenue, so after learning that First Merit Bank in Cleveland owned the clock, he approached them about buying it.
So we contacted their manager. They told us who owned the building, so we negotiated a deal with him.
James says they literally picked the clock up right off the street, laid it on the bed of a truck, and drove to Fredericktown.
Sad thing. It's a very sad thing for Cleveland that it happened, because the clock up on Euclid Avenue, where 50,000 people a day go by, would have been great, standing in front of the old original store building.
Even without the clock, many Clevelanders remember the great store that once stood there. It was so successful, Ball decided to branch out to Chicago in 1918, establishing the Norris Allister Ball Company and making his son president. It became the largest wholesale distributor of standard railroad watches in America. Just a few years later, Webb C. Ball passed away on March 6, 1922, at the age of 74. He's buried in Cleveland's Lakeview Cemetery, among many of the city's other entrepreneurial greats. His company operated for more than 4 decades after his death, until closing in 1962. a time when a number of downtown Cleveland businesses were also closing their doors. The Ball watch name has resurfaced in recent years by a Florida-based company unrelated to Ball's descendants. Nearly 100 years after his death, Webb C. Ball's legacy lives on literally and figuratively in the pockets of generations to come.
Depending on the watch I'm holding, I feel that, maybe who held this watch, maybe who used it at one time.
And certainly remembering the man behind its creation. Ball set an incredibly high standard for quality and precise timekeeping on the railroads, and that much-needed accuracy and uniformity has not only saved lives, but has contributed to our country's growth and expansion, improving the safety of transportation in the United States. There's no way to calculate how many lives have been saved or touched by Ball's work, but there is no denying the quality that went into each timepiece etched with the Webb C. Ball name.
I think he was probably one of the single most important people in the history of watchmaking, at least in this country as far as railroad accurate watches is concerned.
A century or so later, his watches and clocks are still ticking away, tangible reminders of a rich period of Cleveland history and a pivotal time for the railroad watch industry, keeping those lucky enough to own one forever on the ball.